show. Thanks for joining today. We have a great guest today. I'm really excited to talk to him. His name is Dr. Mark Sherwood. He's running for the governor of Oklahoma. One of the pillars of his campaign is no mandatory masks, vaccines, vaccine passports, or lockdowns. So I definitely want to talk to him about that. Just to give him a brief introduction, along with his wife, Dr. Michele Sherwood, he's the co-founder of a successful functional medicine practice in Oklahoma that helps patients from around the world find the health they were created to enjoy. He's also a best-selling author, podcaster, movie producer, media personality, and he's co-founded Hope Dealers International to reach beyond his clinic and empower people worldwide to take control of their health. He's also co-authored three Amazon #1 best-selling books with his wife: The Quest for Wellness, Fork Your Diet, and Surviving the Garden of Eden. They have been seen on national TV, been quoted on CNN, featured on CBN, and are regular contributors of many national publications. Their full length movie, Fork Your Diet, has over 15 million minutes viewed in the US and the UK. And their second motion picture, The Prayer List, was just released worldwide. Their most recent film, WWJR, is set for release Easter 2022, or it was released Easter 2022, so we can talk about that too. He's also a 24-year veteran of the police force, including 10 years on the SWAT team, a former state and regional bodybuilding champion, and ex-professional football player, or baseball player, sorry. Looks like a football player. So without further ado, let me bring on Dr. Mark Sherwood. Hey, Dr. Sherwood. Let me just fix the screen here. Dr. Sherwood, hey, great to have you.
Hey, Dr. Haider, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate you very much.
Total pleasure. So I guess without further ado, just since I just read that, can you just tell us briefly about the WWJR? What was that about?
Yeah, WWJR stands for When Will Jesus Return? And the idea behind this kind of satirical comedy is here's Jesus actually here on earth interacting, intermingling with people in a comedic fashion, of course, and people are not really recognizing who he is. They're calling him Jesus, and funny things like that. And it sort of peaks with the idea that everybody that has a real encounter with this character, Jesus, actually his life improves exponentially. So it'll make you smile, it'll make you laugh, a little bit of tears, but ultimately it'll leave you clapping with enthusiasm and motivation.
Sounds awesome. So to get over to basically the pillars of your campaign, what prompted you to run? It seems like you've had probably like half a dozen careers and you've excelled at all of them. So I'm sure you'll make a great governor. And I would, if I was in Oklahoma, I would vote for you. But what was it that kind of got you thinking that we need a new governor and that I'm the guy for that job?
Well, it seems like everybody's wired for certain things, Dr. Hyder. It's like some people are wired to fight battles straight uphill. And I think I'm one of those for whatever reason. I'm no better than anybody else. There's just different roles and positions that people are supposed to be in. And back in probably March of 2020, when the world came collapsing down around us, I looked for medical personnel, I looked for governmental personnel, I looked for spiritual advisors, pastors, leaders to step up and lead with any kind of faith, any kind of confidence. And frankly, I didn't see it. And it really frustrated me to no end. And through a year of fighting that battle, we had great success, treating people with COVID or exposed to COVID. Nobody died. And I couldn't get any media to cover the coverage or cover the story, even though we had media personalities and TV hosts in our clinic. And that got me to understanding that there really was an agenda through propaganda driven by our media. And it was slanted and biased. And then I began to study, and I've always been a very observant guy. And I realized we didn't have any leadership, and they were all kind of bought and paid for. And it was like this good old boy or good old girl system that was all about the elitist and the peasants. And we, the peasants, were that instead of we, the people. And probably the late spring of 2021, truly, God began to lay it on my heart to get involved in politics. I said to my wife one morning, I said, sweetheart, I got something to tell you. I called my wife my queen. And she said, what is it? Like it was going to be something bad. And because I had no idea what she was going to say. I felt like God was calling me to run for office. Didn't know what was. And she said she would support me in any way, anything I did. And a few weeks later, people that we did not know kept coming to us and say, You need to run for governor. You need to run for governor. Then I realized the governor's job was to lead by representation and protection of the Constitution of the United States. And then I began to study on what was happening. I realized that was not happening with the majority of governors, especially in my state. I did not see that. And I began to look around and see corruption and so-called, favors given. And it was clear at that point through God's direction to be obedient, Dr. Haider, just to be obedient. And it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about being obedient. Will you step up and at least take the first step and honor the call? And we said yes and have not looked back.
That's great. So when you're saying be obedient, are you talking about to the kind of the call that you felt to serve as governor or to serve politically the people of Oklahoma?
Yes, my life has spent, mentioned law enforcement, protection and service. Always something in me put it where I felt like I was supposed to stand in the gap, interpose for people that could not care or didn't know how to care or defend themselves. So it was just a continuation of that. And then when I got into the area of naturopathic doctor, it was still about protection and service. Sometimes people from our protection of ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it just progressed. So the mission that I've been doing for 35 years now has not changed. It's the same mission. It's just expanded into different areas. And just like God called us to heal people and put them on a pathway to healing, now he's called us to heal the economy, to heal the hope, to heal a people of a state. So it's the same mission. It's just different realms of that conviction and that passion.
I see. And so can you talk to us about a little bit about the specific problems you saw in Oklahoma? And maybe it was the same problems that we all saw all over the United States, but was there, something different about what was going on in Oklahoma? And, what did you identify that could have been done differently? And what would you do moving forward in the future?
Well, first of all, like everybody else experienced, the idea of mandates, lockdowns, etc. That was a clear violation of the Constitution. That was a violation of the rights as described in the Constitution as given to us originally by God. And when I saw that, especially with Oklahoma, known as a true red, true conservative state, I realized, no, we're not. We have leadership that doesn't know the Constitution. They swear to protect something they did not know. Under our administration, there will never be lockdowns. There will never be mandates. There will never be vaccine mandates as a condition of employment, shopping, dining, conversing with people, medical care. We just cannot do that because we, the people, have a choice. No one forces us, Dr. Haider, to take an aspirin. And certainly, I wish people ate healthy, but I'm not going to force people to not eat a cheeseburger, even though I know that's not good.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so this is where we have to get. And we haven't had the true patriotism step up with the willingness to die for a cause as a whole in some 247 years, because we've never realized how far we are backed into a corner. And that's what we're going to bring to the table. The true patriot, interpositional leader that's willing to step up on behalf of the people to represent the people, not go into that to get rich, but to represent the people to go in to serve, not because my wife and I don't need this job. Mm-hmm. It has to be done. And we are called at this point in time to do it, to go in there to serve, to take a pause break out of our own life and go serve, just like the founding fathers intended upon it to be. They didn't call for lifelong career politicians. It wasn't that at all. So we would not have those mandates. We would have true representation. And this is important, true, courageous standards and stances in regard to the sovereignty of the states. The 10th Amendment has been trampled upon, and it's been not understood. It's been forgotten. The people and the states retain the power, literally, over the federal government. and the states formed the federal government. It wasn't the way around, and that is what people forgot. We've fed the beast called the federal government, and what you feed the most, it will either eat you or bless you. And we fed something that's eating us alive, one right at a time.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've wondered, why is it? Is it just like a habit that's, developed over the last couple of hundred years that, the federal government has gotten more and more power? Um, or has it been codified into some law outside the Constitution? I mean, or outside the Bill of Rights? Is it, or outside the Constitution? So, like, the states have seems to have given up their power,
Yeah.
and is it possible to take it back at this point?
Yes. In other words, let's look at the history here. The founding fathers clearly identified the temptation to fall for the trap of fame, influence, money, power. And of course, the Bible says the love of money is the root of all evil. So, Dr. Haider, there we have the issue at hand. And the founding fathers warned against that. That's why they put the 10th Amendment in there, that they specifically want to remind the people that each of you, as these United States, not the United States, these United States, you hold the power over the federal government unless you give it over to them. And that power has never been given over. It's been inferred, it's been implied, and it's been allowed. And therefore, we have now this transition from self-governance with this moral code that has been given to each of us to this transition to where now we're looking to be dependent upon the federal government for food, shelter, water protection, money, etc. And there's a transition that's happened over the last 200 years, but it's been accelerated over the last, say, 20, 25, 30 years because we have not done anything about it. And we've taught government less in schools. We've pulled God out of schools. We pulled the Ten Commandments out. We pulled this teaching of Judeo-Christian values, not that others are excluded, but we've pulled that out of schools. And because of that, we've seen an erosion and a loss of teaching from several generations. And you kind of get what you pay for with that. And so we've acquiesced in our responsibilities, decay the family, and now we have, and it's going to take courageous steps by true leadership. And it's not going to take everyone, because everyone doesn't need to do it, but it's going to take the vocal few, just like 56 people signed the Declaration of Independence. Just 56, not 5,600. And here we are still hanging on to the idea of this republic because 56 brave souls. But Dr. Haider, there's more than 56 right now. There are millions of people around this great nation that are willing to sign their name on that idea of a Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of patriots in America who, and I agree with you, that have seen what's happened in the last couple of years, and they're ready to, make a change and fight for a change. One of the things that I've seen happen during this, the pandemic response, it seemed to me at least that the response was more harmful than the pandemic itself, and we saw this in non-COVID illnesses and deaths rising dramatically. There were deaths of despair, and then beyond that, just economic devastation. And what it seemed to have done was further concentrate wealth at the very top. The WalMarts and the Amazons of the world. Um, they took market share from small and medium-sized businesses all over the country. So people, restaurants went under, but all kinds of businesses, right? Like if you were a mom and pop in a little town in Oklahoma somewhere, and you were, selling local goods, competing, in some way or another with Amazon or Walmart, you may have had to shutter, your doors and turn customers away, and people went online, right, and ordered from these big box retailers. So at this point, is it possible to recover, and what would it take, politically, to, I guess, shift shift the focus back towards, small and medium-sized businesses away from these large corporations? Is there something you can do on the state level for your state specifically to help, spur the creation or the recreation of those jobs that were lost and those businesses that were lost?
There is. It's a multi-layered approach that begins with this idea of having courage and having faith. We have to have that primarily, number one, to realize that we have made a mistake. We made a mistake depending too much on the federal government, taking their funds, allowing them to reach into the states, and sort of by implication and inference, as I talked about, take away the state's power. We've got to get it back. And by stepping up and having the governors across these United States and the sheriffs, which are the highest ranking elected official in the county, if we get that idea back, there are boundaries and borders that are at states, not just the nation borders, but the states. And we can refuse to take the government funds. And if we do take it, we're not going to allow them to dictate what we do with it. So we have to have the guts to step up, stand firm. And my biggest concern is right now, quite transparently, is that if we don't have the guts to step up, we will never have the guts to step up. We have a window right now of opportunity that is clear. And it's going to take a concerted effort, in my case, by the citizens of Oklahoma, to speak up, stand up, step up, and become involved in the solution. When we bring back competitive industries, as you mentioned, within the state, this is what I see happening long term. Since there's no mandates, no lockdowns, nothing here in this state, we're going to have a state that's truly free. It will mimic and go far and above the idea of the state of Florida's freedom. Governor DeSantis has done an amazing job. My hat's off to that man. I think he's done outstanding. I think there's more that we can do. And I think by doing that, we'll create a free state where people will line up here, businesses, entities, etc., to want to come in here. Here's the key. We don't have to take them all. We get the opportunity to say yes or no, because we don't want to have, the quote unquote woke culture coming in here and influencing the industry and influence the climate and the environment of Oklahoma. We can keep Oklahoma an environment that is free, maintains our culture, and gives this idea of hope. And when we do that, it's going to be a beacon of hope for the whole world to see. I really believe that.
That sounds great. The one point that you made there about maybe refusing funds or taking the funds without any strings attached, I think is a really important point that you brought up, because the federal government sent relief, quote unquote, relief funds to churches, synagogues, mosques, like every organization you can imagine. Some of them, you're left thinking, well, what are they going to do with these funds? They're forced to close down. Like, what are they going to use them for? And so a lot of people have wondered, did those come with strings attached? Is that why, all these leaders that we thought we had in our communities didn't say anything, didn't speak up, and didn't, fight back against, things that we expected them, I guess, to fight for us for? What is your take on that? Do you think that those funds had strings attached?
I do. And I'll give you an example. The Medicare Medicaid system right now, they know that even the Supreme Court's, let's call it not a ruling, but a punting on the issue of mandates. When they punted it back, they basically said, well, since the federal government gives these medical centers these funds, then because they're given the funds, they can sort of dictate what you do. And of course, that's had a ripple effect across our country, because within the medical facilities, the physicians are sort of handcuffed, and they have to do certain protocols, even though there might be other protocols that they might want to consider. We need to have the ability to have a physician as a healer be able to use the entire gamut of a toolbox at their disposal based upon their training experience to save and preserve life. That's the point. And so because of that, we saw that happen, and we saw it sort of restrict the protocols that were allowed. And that ripple effect has gone over into companies, because the Supreme Court did not say that companies can't do it. So it gave an idea that the idea of lockdowns were perhaps good. And so that's just one example with federal money with strings. When a hospital system, I believe, and I really am not crazy, I think this is true. In Oklahoma, for example, says, you know what? We love you, federal government. We appreciate your help, but we're going to save lives. And they're going to do that. They're going to save lives. They're not going to mandate these ridiculous things upon employees to cause them to lose their job based upon what they choose or choose not to do. And when they do that and the CEOs push back, I do not believe in one moment the bullying tactics of the federal government. I don't think they'd pull that money back. I don't think they have the guts, because I think when one hospital system steps up and says no, other ones will do the same thing because it's the right thing to do. We don't want to see people die. We want to see people live, and we want to do whatever we can to keep people alive. And frankly, I've been disappointed in the lack of stepping up in that area as an example.
That's a great point. So what can you do at this point, right? I mean, these hospital systems have already taken these funds, and pharmacists all over the country, including I'm sure Oklahoma, restricted doctors' abilities to prescribe hydroxychloroquine. Even independent doctors, right, who weren't part of a system who wanted to prescribe this, ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or other off-label medications. The pharmacists were told by their licensing boards, I think not to do this. The American Medical Association sent letters to me and every other doctor in America in association with the American Pharmacy Board and I think the American Pathology Board, saying that we recommend against ivermectin, and they also sent another letter saying that your license is at risk if you if you say anything negative about vaccines, if you spread misinformation. Who defines misinformation? That was the question that was left unanswered. But what can you do at this point to turn the tide and give people, physicians autonomy back, and pharmacists their autonomy back, and patients their autonomy back?
Well, the vision behind that is to understand that the state can pass laws that are contrary to the federal government. I'll give you one example of that. The states passed laws that says marijuana was legal when the federal government still says it's illegal. So the states can legislatively do things to bring autonomy and protection. And that's just one angle. And let us understand that when you're talking about the idea of leadership going into a battle, Dr. Haider, we are in a battle, as you just described so beautifully. Because doctors don't want to do all of that. They're like, oh my gosh, another one's coming down the pike. Why can't I speak what I believe is truth? Because you always have before. Why is this vaccine different? Why is this condition different when the lethality rate is not really different? And why can't you talk about in practices nutrition? Well, I've seen that before too. So I think legislatively you can do a few things. Then I think you have to have a step of faith too, to believe that just like the United States, these United States that were formed with the idea that we don't know all the steps, but we just know that's not working. And we serve you notice, federal government, in this case, reliving 250 years ago, we serve you notice, Great Britain, that this is not working and we're not going to do this anymore. And they trusted, they had faith in a higher power, in that case, God. And they allowed God to do some incredible things and bring about the country that we have now, which frankly is the last hope the world has at this point.
Yeah, I think looking at it today, I just had this thought that it seemed like our system was more like the EU in the past, where it was almost like countries. Like,
Yeah.
state kind of meant country. State didn't mean something below country, right? They were kind of these countries that were loosely affiliated, and then they said, we're going to have kind of a overarching system in place, kind of like what the EU is, in Europe. And so that makes sense. One thing, talking about Europe, what we saw with Sweden was that they did kind of push back, quite strongly against the pandemic response that was recommended by WHO and was taken up by essentially every other country except for a couple in Africa. And what they experienced was this media firestorm, right? And that's got to make people, even in Sweden, start to think twice about, like, are we really doing the right thing? I mean,
Mhm.
everyone else is saying that we're doing the wrong thing. We're killing people. We're, harming people. This is, um, so like, how can you deal with that at the state level with basically the propaganda that we've seen? I have to call it the way I see it. I
Yeah.
think it's just propaganda. How can you fight back against that at the state level?
We had to fight back blow for blow, and you got to be smarter than that. And then we can't shut down the propaganda that is, because it's controlled by big pharma. We all know that. Now, I don't control the federal government legislation, but if I did, one of the things that I would push if I were president of these United States is to push the idea of not allowing big pharma to advertise to individual people and buy advertising on TV ever again, because we're one of the few countries that do that, and that actually is costing the biggest money, the funding, and that's why they're lobbying so hard. So if you take that tool away, which is the right thing to do, by the way, and put it back in the hands of the physicians to educate physician as teacher, as we know, then that would help. But as a state level, you have to communicate a narrative. The governor is in a unique position. You mentioned something about these countries. That's exactly how these United States were birthed. Little countries, they all had their little individual, almost different denominational churches way back one of the 13 colonies. And they all have a governor, they all have their legislative chambers, they all have their capital, just like a country. And that's exactly what it was intended to be. And if we can get that idea back, the governor and the people set the tone for the culture and environment of that particular state slash sovereign state slash country. And so we get that back, the belief system comes back, and the rest of these United States, there might be some states that think Oklahoma is a bunch of idiot, stupid fools, but you don't have to live there. You can if you want to. And so we offer people a choice, which is the beauty of this great land we live in. But I think you control the narrative, and you have to offset the narrative with a different narrative of hope. And frankly, that hasn't really been done to the level that I think it could have. There's a lot of media like yourself that are setting a tone, but it's competing against all this propaganda, suffocating socialistic agenda. And the key is we have to keep stepping up and chipping away, chipping away, chipping away. And I truly believe we're getting a lot of momentum now that will not be stopped.
Definitely. I think the momentum is building, and definitely in alternative media. And so I hope there's not a crackdown of some kind on alternative media. Um, so, how, maybe speak a little bit more about getting to the root cause. Like you were mentioning that, and I agree with you that, maybe big pharma shouldn't be allowed to advertise directly to patients and, go talk to your doctor about such and such,
Yeah.
disease that you never knew you had. Let's medicalize everything. But what is there anything else that we can do to correct the root cause of our troubles? At least what we've seen, let's focus on the pandemic. What went wrong in the pandemic? What in your eyes were the root causes, or maybe the one root cause of our faulty pandemic response, and how do we prevent that from happening in the future? And an additional kind of addendum, would there be any place for removing the ability of big pharma to patent medications for 20 years? And the reason I'm asking that is because um, there's this incentive in place currently with big pharma to denigrate, any drug that's off patent that they can't make a lot of money off of, and it's always about the newest and best thing. And studies have shown that a lot of the drugs that come out, they're like not improvements over older drugs at all, but they're
Mhm.
charged at much higher rates. And there's obviously collusion with the journals involved in publishing these studies. And I mean, there's a whole lot of problems that need fixing. But can you identify maybe some of the root causes that you maybe address? Is it possible to address it at the state level? If not, what can we as a country do to solve this problem?
Well, I think the root cause of a lot of our issues now with our health goes back to the idea when the government sort of took over the narrative of health back in the 70s and 80s with this idea of food pyramid. That was an erroneous, messed up situation. At that point, we were all doing pretty well. And then came in this thing called the food pyramid with the high level of grains. And that brought in the idea of subsidies. And then you had also the vaccine transference of liability about that same time period from the manufacturers to the government. So you had this high subsidy food coming in that was being made very cheap that people would buy because the government was trusted to give you true information. And it didn't do that. We saw obesity climb. At the time of the food pyramid initiation, only one state, Dr. Haider, had an obesity rate of over 10%. It took 11 years for every state, with the exception of one, to rise. And now we have many, many states that are over 50, approaching 60%. And many studies predict that obesity and or overweight will overtake this country with 100% by 2050. So it's coming up very rapidly. We've seen the same time the increase in autism, 1 in 40,000 40 years ago to 1 in 40 now, approximately, or less, and then 1 in 2 if that continues by 2050. So that the giving up of our self-governance, planting, teaching, eating good food, physical activity, being outside, that created a higher lethality of these viruses getting into and affecting our humanness, right? And so we had lessened ability. Our immune systems are definitely interfered with and sort of castrated. They can't fight the way they used to. So we have become weaker from an immune standpoint. And we see over the last 2.5 years, some studies indicate that our life expectancy as a whole across these United States has decreased 2.5 years. I mean, this is the first time this happened in decades. And so it all began back then. And that's what we teach here at our clinic in Tulsa, Oklahoma, this idea of nutrition, sleep, exercise, stress management. We look at genetics. What does our genes tell us? We look at, hormone therapy, because when we miss those things, we're losing communication. And we look at peptides, and we look at emotional health and spiritual health. And by putting all that together, you get the idea of how to bring about a functional, optimal health human that is resilient to the life that we live right now in this country and world.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. One thing I wanted to maybe focus on that's along the same lines is the toxins and chemicals in the environment. There have been studies showing that there's hundreds of chemicals in fetal cord blood,
Yep.
even. So we're born already stuffed full of chemicals. And this is, these are crossing the placenta, and we haven't eaten a single bite of,
Right.
canola oil or pesticide laden wheat.
Yeah.
And so there's obesogens. There's this idea that it's not just the diet. So there's an element maybe of so not just it's not genetics, because our genetics haven't really changed for thousands of years, but epigenetics perhaps, and maybe each succeeding generation is less able to put up with a poor diet than their ancestors were able to. But certainly the diet has a big part to play. But there's also studies showing that there's obesogens as well that are causing a big problem. And you have a lot of very overweight people come to you and like, I hardly eat anything and I just can't lose weight. So it seems to me, let me know what your thoughts are on this, that we had a robust environmentalist movement in this country, and it seems to have been hijacked by this hyper focus on CO2 to the exclusion of everything else. I mean, it's like no one cares anymore about chemicals being dumped in rivers and antibiotics being dumped in rivers and the water supply and the air quality aside from CO2. I mean, have you given any thought to this? And do you deal with toxins in your patients and removing them? And how would you, as a governor, address toxins, flowing into the environment aside from CO2?
Well, you bring up a very good point. People get us hyper focused off on one thing to the exclusion of attention to perhaps the forest for the tree kind of analogy. But yes, we see toxins all the time. The obesogens, the estrogenic compounds that are everywhere. In our water supply, in our food, in our cosmetics. In things that we drink. things that we breathe, the persistency of the organic pollutants is shocking. And when you look at genetics, as you correctly pointed out, they haven't changed maybe 2% in 10,000 years. So we really have to improve, number one, the ability of us from an internal capacity, from a systems capacity to handle the toxins. In other words, to ensure that we have plenty of mitochondrial function to drive the bus of ATP production, to ensure that we have good functions from systems. And that's the very basic of existence. And then at the same time, we need to provide education for people. And I spend hours and hours talking to people about, how to filter water properly, how to plant properly. And it is shocking what people don't know. And in the state of Oklahoma, as a governor capacity, I want to promote more natural farming, more farmers markets, more buying straight from each other like we used to do, because that promotes more health. We don't need to, be eating cows that are sort of grown in these confined animal feeding operations with high antibiotic, standing in their fecal matter, the waste material, and we're feeding them hormones and antibiotics just to get them fat fast so that we can sell them by weight and make more money. So, all that said, it is crushing the human being's ability to maintain a healthy weight. And we know that excess fat tissue creates excess inflammation. And of course, that itself is a hallmark of all disease processes, that chronic systemic inflammation scenario. So, you're right. It's all of that combined. And we've done our part here. We continue to do our part to work on improving our detoxification abilities through education, supplements, food, nutrition, etc.
Great. That's a really important thing to focus on. So to highlight one of the things you mentioned there, how do you practically go about promoting local economies and or healthy farming practices in a state level at the state level?
Yeah, that's a super question. We've got to take the federal strings off of some of our local farmers. We have to have the vision back where the state can indeed be agriculturally independent, economically independent, energy independent of the federal government. And then you have a lot of farmers markets, a bunch of farm to tables. You have the mom and pop businesses able to survive. And you give people an opportunity to invest their hard-earned money into the local economy, as opposed to being forced to go with the big box stores like the Walmarts, to be forced to order from Amazon. Because when you do that, you're feeding an engine that is not healthy. And even frankly, you can say you're feeding communism and making it grow. And so we want to shift the focus to give people a true alternative. And I'm not talking about just in agriculture, maybe schools, another one, too, the same idea. And when we do that, people have hope, and you can invest your money where you want. And that yields a free market system, giving people a true choice instead of just limiting them with a window with no choice.
Absolutely. So I'm going to give you a bit of a maybe crazy question here. And so this is based on some stuff I've read from some modern economists, and they link a lot of the ills in our society to the fiat monetary system. And so you can see, graphs starting in 1971 when we went off the gold standard completely, showing that there's a diversion, or we before that we had real wages rising, along with productivity, and so it seemed like it was more of a fair system where the benefits between labor and capital were equally distributed. And after 1971, when we go off gold, the rise in productivity continues and actually speeds up. But the rise in real wages, like, it goes in the opposite direction. It starts plummeting. And so the argument, I guess, is that there's something about time preference that changes in human beings. And what that means is that when your money's losing value, and you can kind of understand this in the most extreme sense, like you go to Venezuela and you have hyperinflation, and you're getting paid twice a day, and you can't really think about the future. You have to just, as soon as you get the money, you have to go and buy something, right? Otherwise, in the afternoon, it'll be double the price. But between hyperinflation and regular inflation, and extra, inflation like we have now. We have like 8% inflation when our aim is to be at around 2%. When you're at 8%, you're less able to think about the future and plan ahead than you would be at 2% inflation, is kind of the idea. And so what that creates is short-term thinking, and let's just we can't really save for the future, we can't plan ahead, and it affects morality. You can't really, maybe you're more inclined to cut corners, at a societal level, at a local level, at a personal level, at the level of a company. And your money's constantly losing value. So you can't really just put your money in the bank and, okay, my savings are fine. You have to be kind of aggressive. You have to figure out how to invest it to,
Yeah.
escape inflation. And the argument continues saying that since governments are behind the inflation, and people are seeing that they're able to buy less and less, they can't afford the real stuff anymore. That steak is more expensive, and real food is more expensive. So now we got to convince people that actually the cheaper stuff is better for you, right? So it's kind of like the fiat health system is part of the fiat monetary system, where and so government funding, kind of goes into the pockets of researchers who are promoting these kind of ideas like, hey, vegetable oils are great, it's heart healthy, stop eating animal fat. And the idea is that the government kind of funds things that will minimize the effects of inflation. So I'm just wondering if you've thought of that, and if you think that this is the crazy part of the question, would it be possible to have local currencies to fight back against that?
I think it would, because you go back to the idea of, pre, statehood. There was an idea of local currencies. It was the barter system. And I've told people now to consider a diversification of their portfolios from all the stocks and bonds and banks and all that to maybe some hard, tangible assets like gold and silver. And by doing that, you at least have something here, because you're right. We're in the hyperinflation mode. It's going to get bigger the way I see it. It's bound to collapse because we keep printing money with no gold backing. It has no value. And so I do believe that's the agenda, perhaps from a global elite feud, because if you can cripple a people, specifically America, just above the point of death, you win. You control the whole globe, because America does represent the last island of hope. And you mentioned something key about future. When people don't have hope for a future, they have no hope for life. And when you have no hope for life, you're looking for anywhere, anybody, anything to help you through that day, through that moment. You become very instantaneous, reactive versus proactive and prehabilitative. And I find that that's very tragic for mankind, because the greatest thing we can have that keeps us going, Dr. Haider, is hope. Hope
Definitely, yeah.
fuels the heart. It fuels the system. It fuels the very aura of mankind to keep us going. So, I do believe we can get back there. It's going to take some bold steps, and it's going to take states and people to step up and say, we are willing to be number one. We're willing to be that first state to take that first step. And that's been my whole mission. Again, I don't envy my position. I mean, I'm being very clear in this. It has to be done. We have to have confidence. We have to do something radically different to alter the course. And not to be a naysayer, but if we don't do something radically different, we're on a crash course to exactly what you described.
Definitely. I want to go back to one of the things you were talking about earlier about no lockdowns, right, in the
Yep.
future. So I don't want to get too conspiracy theorist about it,
Yeah.
but what people at the ground level have seen is that you had Event 201 take place. It was kind of a tabletop exercise about a coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah.
And then a few months later, we have a coronavirus pandemic. So people are kind of like, well, that's kind of strange, coincidental, maybe. But apparently, about a year ago, there was another tabletop exercise about a smallpox pandemic spreading all over the world. Or actually, no, sorry, it wasn't smallpox; it was monkeypox.
Oh, yeah.
This was a year ago. So
Yeah.
not now, but a year ago, there was a tabletop exercise about monkeypox, um, and um, and they predicted that it would happen literally when it did happen, like in the second week of March or whatever, whenever
Wow.
it actually happened. So this again is very strange, and maybe there's just maybe there's millions of these tabletop exercises, and that explains it. They're doing them for everything, perhaps. Um, but I guess the point of the question is, what if something like smallpox were to start spreading? And we ended up with economy killing lockdowns due to a virus that had a point 0.1 or point 0.2. I mean, you can argue death rate, right?
Yeah.
0.2%, 0.3%. It's pretty low, right? Regardless of which number you choose, very very low death rate. Is A lot of people would argue similar to a bad flu year, and we had such a push for fear-inducing, propaganda in this country that people lost their minds. Okay, and I think I would argue a lot of people still haven't regained them. Right? They don't have sense anymore to evaluate what's going on logically, and it's hard to talk to them and give them, that they can't, take new information and change their opinions. And I think the reason is that it's struck fear in the hearts of so many. And so just imagine for me, that there were a bioterror attack of smallpox or tularemia or plague, or, we have a bunch of things. The bench is really deep, in terms
Mhm.
of bioweapons that the US has in its labs. Russia has some, and and just imagine, I mean, what would happen if something like that were spreading? How would you argue to the people of Oklahoma that we shouldn't have lockdowns if it's really, really a deadly disease? Or should there be targeted lockdowns? Or, like, what would you do? How would you deal with a really bad one?
Well, I think that, and it's funny, I've been asked about that idea of a question recently because, again, I, like you, believe that the lockdowns hurt us more, the isolation, loneliness, etc. But frankly, I would first of all determine, is what I'm being told real? Because again, the media who's broadcasting information may or may not be real.
Mm,
And I would want to get credible information and sources behind it. I would openly communicate to the people and I would give them input. In other words, can you imagine a governor giving input to the citizens of the state and says, what do you guys think?
mm,
And taking suggestions and opening this up to what we want to do. And at some point in time, with all these bioweapons coming and all this threat, this fear tactic, as I do not believe these tabletop exercises are all just coincidences. I think there's an agenda out there. But like you, not to get into the conspiracy idea of it. But it gets to this point, Dr. Haider, would we as human beings rather die alone and sick or live openly and die getting a hug from somebody, for example? As for me, I'd rather die in someone's arms than I would die alone in a hospital bed with nobody around. And that's just me. And it's the overriding theme, as crazy it might sound, I really believe this. I don't believe any human being is going to die one day quicker than they're supposed to. And I base my faith on that when there is protection that I can't see, I can't feel. You and I both have seen some unexplainable things take place. I've watched people in my office that had known diseases with no known cure walk out of my office with a cure. And I couldn't explain it. So I just believe in a higher power. In my case, it's God, that we have ways out of this. And I would approach it, as I stated, with a very open, honest, not hidden agenda, and certainly not force, and see where the chips may fall. Could we perhaps rule out a targeted isolation period for someone that is sick? Of course not. I mean, we want to have that on the table, but we want to get people informed. And if they get sick and it truly is something, well, they wouldn't want to infect their family. They'd want to go get alone and get treatment and get healed and then go back. So I think there's a balance there. And I think that's the right way to approach it, which we hadn't seen.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Public health has been around for over 1,000 years, and we have a lot of experience with pandemics going back thousands of years in human history, and a lot longer than that, actually, probably tens of thousands of years.
Mm.
And things, people even before the age of, before we understood that there were microorganisms. I mean, people kind of understood that this is contagious. I can get it from the person who has it,
Yeah,
and they isolated those people. What we've never seen in public health is a society-wide lockdown of healthy people,
that's right.
along with the sick. Um, Sometimes we've seen, like with the plague, they would say, okay, the plague is in the city, we don't want people leaving, so maybe targeted, to place where it actually is, but not
Mm.
like the whole country. Right.
Right.
Um, and so I think, so I agree with you on that. One of the problems that I saw, and I'd like to get your take on this, was that we didn't allow a healthy debate. So you want to be guided by science, but science isn't some monolithic thing where Fauci is not science. Right? So science is a matter of debate, and we're constantly learning things, and you're always going to have different opposing points of view, and maybe 100 different views on any matter. But if you allow free debate without censorship, the truth wins out, right, in the end, because the truth can defend itself. And if everyone's kind of watching the debate, and you have a lot of smart people watching it, you'll be able to change minds eventually, because not everyone is wedded to one idea, and eventually you'll shift opinion. But what we have a tendency as human societies, you know going back to the very beginning, right? Like, we tend to think that we are always more evolved than our ancestors. Like,
Mm.
we look back at the Spanish Inquisition and we're like, we would never do that. We're we would not, we would never do it. But I would argue we did do that, and we are doing that. And we look at Galileo and we say, that was ridiculous. Why did they do that to Galileo? So my point is that we are doing it now, and
Yeah.
we continue to do it. Every generation thinks that they figured it all out, and every um, you know, authority treats dissidents the same way. So how do you encourage healthy debate in Oklahoma, especially, that's where you're
Yeah.
hopefully going to be elected? How do you collect all those different views and prevent them from being silenced, and get input from scientists from who have all different kinds of ideas, and then who at the end of the day decides, right, how to move forward?
Well, obviously, you have to have someone that's going to make that judgment call based upon information and wisdom. But first, you have to remove the political science part out of
Mhm.
science. That's
Yeah.
key, right? And then within science, we all know that the genius of it all is the ability to ask why along the way. So the ability to question science has allowed us to evolve science. The very idea of what we thought would be true 20 years ago has now shown to be not true in that idea. So we have to not refuse to hear the other side of the coin, or the third side of a two-sided coin, the outside of the box idea. And we have done that. We have, all of us in our country have seen the opinions be silenced. And that's the idea of leading into this communist, Marxist, socialistic ideology where opinions are limited, just like it is in the CCP right now. The idea of a citizen not being able to ask, why are you doing that, limits our free speech. You have to sit down. Like in our state, we have a problem right now. It's very unique with our 39 tribes. There's no communication between the sovereign tribal nations and the sovereign state of Oklahoma. They've driven the relationship in opposite directions. They've
Mm.
drawn the line in the sand, and I've said they need to sit down in the sand and build a sandcastle together. That's the point. You have to sit down together and hear. And God gave us two ears and one mouth for a reason. In other words, to listen twice as much. And we've forgotten that, Dr. Haider. And I believe that that needs to come back, a non-judgmental approach to listening to another opposing side. I would rather sit down with someone who openly hated my guts, openly hated God. I would rather sit right down with them and converse with them in a peaceful environment, because at least you know where they stand, than I would sit down with someone who doesn't offer any opinion other than the popular opinion, because that's not how you get anything done. So I think we have to get to that point at some point, and I'm willing to do that as the next governor of Oklahoma, to involve all opinions, because everybody has an opinion. Every opinion matters, and it's important, and we've got to get back to that point.
Absolutely, I agree with you. We have maybe 5 minutes, and I want to maybe 4 minutes, and I want to shift focus a little bit and talk at least briefly about long COVID and vaccine injuries. And what I've seen in my own practice is that a lot of people have blinders on. They don't think this exists. Both patients and doctors, and so it seems a lot of people are suffering. Any study you look at in terms of prevalence of long COVID, I mean, it's staggeringly high. It's a lot, millions of people. And at the same time, vaccines, it seems the federal government has just continued to harp on the fact that they're just quote unquote safe and effective, and they can't admit that there's a single side effect or a single death attributable to them. And so, can you just speak a little bit about, I guess one question I have on this topic is there something you can do in the state of Oklahoma to help highlight this issue, and help people, just bring awareness to it? And then, after that, what, in your experience, can people do to get better from these things?
Well, I think we saw a recent study come out. I don't remember the number of people in it, but it was basically long haul COVID. They had a commonality of mitochondrial failure, dysfunction. And so we want to teach people those things from the platforms of the highest potential that we have. How do we get back to this idea of sufficiency of these essential vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, amino acids that drive the system? And how do we improve this idea of food as medicine? I think that's number one, and giving people hope that they can climb out of this long haul COVID, because it is true, it is real. There's a lot of sustained damage through free radical damage, et cetera, in the human body from this high inducement continuously of the long haul COVID, and even the constancy of vaccines being pushed in there. So, we have hammered that point home, and we've used a lot of the common nutraceuticals, food. We've used molecular hydrogen is kind of a little unique thing we've used to help people. And it's been a fascinating journey, but there is hope out there. And we have to communicate that to people, as opposed to put them in a box and say, well, you're just tough, you got to live with it.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. One issue I never really thought about as a physician is that the way modern medicine works is, studies are done by big pharma, and no one has access to the raw data except for big pharma itself, and they write the paper, and that's how they present it to peer reviewers. Is there anything we can do about this, and is there anything we can do to change that federal relief of liability for vaccine manufacturers?
That's going to take some legislative action from the federal government, of course, to undo what was done. I think it's going to require the proper leadership in both chambers in Washington, D.C., the proper representation, the proper president to lead the way. Nobody today is talking about the health of our nation and the health of the world as being mimickers of our nation, the Western lifestyle. And that, to me, is a major catastrophic pitfall, Dr. Haider, in what we're doing right now. And I think that's got to come back. My wife and I push that in our clinic in Tulsa, of course, but we're going to push that as well from the governance position too, because I think when you do, people get better, and health should be the new contagion. It really should be. And we've got to get health and hope back. And perhaps one day people will become hope and health dealers once again, which is only something that I'm seeing right now as a potential. But it's out there. I believe it can happen.
Great. So just in the next 30 seconds, where can people find you, and how can we contribute to your campaign and help you in any way? Where can people go?
Well, go to Sherwood2022.com. There's a website there with all of our platform stances. You've laid out several of them today. They can download a free app that is really cool. It talks about the same thing. You can share that, use that to vet your own candidates in your own area. Do they publicly put these things out there? And they can contribute through prayer. Please do that. And finances as you're led. It takes money to run a campaign, and it takes faith to run a campaign. And we would appreciate certainly both.
Great. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming. This was great. And I encourage everyone to go to sherwood2022.com and contribute whatever you can. Thanks again.